there was the moral majority that was seeking to push back on some of the secularisation that was happening in our society, but there's also this line of evangelicals that are continuing through the 1980s and the 1990s and onwards, evangelicals who are thinking, how do we continue to preach the gospel into our generation, and are organising around that rather than organising around a particular political issue. So I think what you find is evangelicals are continuing to come up with new ways to present the gospel to a changing culture.
Welcome back to the Shock Absorber podcast. We are back, and I'm glad to be back because we've had 2 weeks off because I was in COVID isolation. But I've taken care of COVID for a second time, and I'm back and ready to go. And it is lovely to be back with a vengeance with my 2 partners in crime, Tim and Stu. How are you guys?
Really good, man.
I got to tell you, I don't want to be locked in my house again, and not podcasting either. That was really upsetting. So I'm glad to be back and actually recording a full podcast today. Guys, we're actually recording on a different day. We usually record on a Friday, but we're actually here at Sorrel Vole Church on a Saturday night. And so if you are listening or watching, you may hear some weird noises coming from the other room because there are people still hanging out tonight. Guys, did you enjoy dinner? Because we did have a very nice dinner. I had would you describe them as gourmet hot dogs?
Gourmet sausage hot dogs, and yes.
That's a good description. That was great. And you guys also took part in an affogato.
I had an affogato.
Yeah, it was very delicious.
For dessert.
It's actually my first affogato.
Is it? Really?
I don't know if I should feel bad about that. Like I feel like I'm old enough to have had one before, but
they were really big in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s. There was that big coffee kind of friends induced coffee culture, cafe culture was a big thing.
Sounds like the affogato might be our cultural artefact today.
Maybe. Well, I don't partake in coffee, so I'll leave you guys to determine that. But speaking of cultural artifacts, how about we get the real one out? And Stu, we talked about Francis Schaeffer in the last episode briefly, towards the end of the last full episode that we did. But you've chosen a book that he wrote, his last book, I believe it was.
It is his last book, yes.
As our cultural artefact. Do you want to fill us in?
Yeah, so Francis Schaeffer was an author in the second half of the 20th century, had quite an influential ministry. He and his wife Edith set up a ministry called L'Abri in Switzerland, and he wrote a number of books about the Christianity and Western culture and how the two interacted. And his last book was called The Great Evangelical Disaster, which is a bit of a sad title, really.
Yeah, a provocative title.
I like that word, provocative. Very provocative.
Why was it provocative as a title?
Well, Schaeffer was trying to make the point that he felt like that Christians had compromised their stand for the truth and morality, and he made a point that he felt like there was almost there was no why left in Christianity. I think if I read the book correctly, he was saying that people had stopped teaching the why to their children, or the why of Christianity, but were just teaching moral imperatives. And so the provocative part of his comment of his book was a deep call to come back to a deep commitment to Christ and a love for his church. So, Louise and I had the opportunity to visit L'Abri in 2000, and that was quite amazing, actually. It was really good because I had read Great Evangelical Disaster, which had been written in 1984 in the early 90s when a friend of mine at church gave me the book, and I was actually really excited about the idea of having a really deep love and commitment to Christ and love for his church. So that book had a bit of influence on, I suppose, our Soul Revival, which this year has come up for its 30th anniversary. So we've been doing Soul Revival now together for 30 years, and the church at Soul Revival Church for 10. So I thought it was worth mentioning the book. He published this in 1984, and he passed away, I think, the same year. So it is an interesting read. He raises some issues in the book that ended up becoming quite big issues that we dealt with on earlier podcasts, actually, when we looked at the 2010s. So in some ways, he kind of predicted some of the conversations that were going to take place in the future. The end of the book, he has this little preface, appendix section, talking about some thoughts on love, and particularly got me interested in thinking about Matthew 22, 37 to 40 about love God and love others is a really crucial and core part of being a Christian. So, yes, I thought that was a pretty good book to point out today.
In your visit to L'Abri, did you gain an idea or an understanding of why he wrote the book?
The water was terrific.
It's just really good water.
In Switzerland, they drink glacial water. Yeah, oh my goodness, the best water I've ever tasted in my life. Yes, it was quite good. So I don't know if that had anything to do with it. No. All jokes aside, I think what L'Abri is supposed to be is a place where you can have a space to have a think about your faith, have a think about and talk to others about the Bible and investigate what it means for your life. And there's also a really high priority in delighting people. So I remember just being delighted the whole time I was there, actually. But interestingly, by 2000, I think there was a lot of people who were almost what I would call refugees from the church who were visiting L'Abri. And I think the ministry had changed a little bit over the years, that by the time I went to L'Abri with Louise, we were only there for a few days, so it's hard to say, but there seemed to be a lot of people that were there that we were talking to that were really dissatisfied with the church, and they were looking for answers. How do they connect to the local church? So I thought that was quite ironic, considering the great evangelical disaster was calling on us to have that love and commitment for the local church. But I think in 2000, that's when I first started thinking something's happening in culture. There's a whole group of evangelical Christians that are feeling really dissatisfied with the local church, and Generation X seemed to be asking some new questions that maybe the baby boomer generation wasn't asking. Maybe that was my impression.
Yeah, okay. And you said that in that book, Great Evangelical Disaster, you talked about the why. Is that perhaps at L'Abri, he was like, at L'Abri you can really focus on and have a real think about the why of your faith? Yeah,
I think if I understand him, he's saying that we were, one of his criticisms of Christianity, evangelicalism in the second half of the 20th century is that parents were saying to their kids, don't have sex outside of marriage, don't drink to get drunk, don't do this, don't do that. But they didn't tell them why those things were important. They were just giving them these moral imperatives. And particularly for baby boomers, who were a part of a generation that was rejecting a whole heap of those, formal traditional ways of thinking, there wasn't a lot of reasoning around why Christians actually taught those kind of things. And so he was trying to bring people back to the Bible, as evangelicals do, to try and get our why from that.
Tim, you're not planning a trip over to Switzerland anytime soon to check it out, or you?
Not unless you pay him. Right? I'd love to go, but it's probably a bit out of the budget at the moment.
Yes, I have been to Switzerland once. It's quite a fun place.
Yeah,
did you like the water?
Place to go.
I didn't try glacial water though.
The water. Everyone drinks glacial water. Apparently, the whole water supply is from melted glaciers.
So Mount Franklin isn't the same.
Oh, mate.
Other waters are available.
It's quite refreshing.
That sounds really cool. I actually would really like to check out glacial water. Anyway, let's. So we left off in the last full episode we did on the kind of coming into the 1980s. Some of the topics we talked about was Ronald Reagan, the influence of the moral majority in terms of electing him in the 1980 election in America. There was the Twisted Sister case about their battle against the PMHRC. Is that correct? I can't remember. But the parents were upset about lyrics including Dee Snider, but Dee Snider seemed to have record quite a good win for the other side in his court case that he the Senate hearing that he turned up for. So towards the end of the second half of the 1980s, in the second election that Ronald Reagan was part of, and he actually won, he was less reliant on the Christian right, as they termed it. But I thought it's also worth defining that the fundamentalists are very much a big part of getting behind Ronald Reagan. Stu, do you want to just quickly define fundamentalists versus evangelicals, that definition again for us?
Yeah, okay. So Marsden's definition of a fundamentalist is an evangelical who's angry about something. And so if an evangelical gets angry about some kind of social issue, then they can become politically active. So a fundamentalist, in my mind, is a politically active evangelical who has started to stand up for a particular issue. So there would have been evangelical parents who would have been worried about the impact of rock and roll on their children, and so they got angry at that and started becoming politically active as a result.
And I'm guessing that would explain some of the focus on some of the issues such as school prayer and gay rights movement, abortion, all those kind of things. They're those things that they felt very important to talk about. That's why they became politically active, to talk about those issues.
Yeah, and we've made a bit of a distinction between evangelical and fundamentalist in this podcast series because we're looking at evangelism, and sometimes people put all evangelicals in the fundamentalist category, and we're saying that there is actually, as we will be talking about in this episode, there is a bit of a distinction between evangelicals who are politically active and those that are simply proclaiming the gospel. That's a really interesting interface that we are looking at.
And I mean, Jerry Falwell, who was the person that established the Moral Majority organisation, he now said when Reagan was first elected, we now have a government in Washington that would help us. But then, given that Reagan in the second half of his term, or he's in his second term, then became less dependent on the Christian right. I wish my assumption would be that the Moral Majority probably weren't very happy about that because they didn't feel they had as much influence on it. But by 1986, effectively, the Moral Majority was retired by Falwell because there were like a lot of campaigns. The campaign that Reagan ran sparked the downfall of many Christian right organisations, and donations dropped off, and they didn't feel like they had as much influence on it. What I'm wondering is that are you aware of that time? If the Christian right and the fundamentalists are unable to get as much influence as they have, how does that affect evangelism? What would have that done to actually affecting the way that people actually evangelise?
Yeah, so I think that it's interesting. Marsden himself says that the fundamentalists are constantly being written off as something that's not going to last very long, and that's another example of it. Like by the end of the 1980s, it looks like the fundamentalists' influence has come to an end. It seemed like a similar moment as in 1928 with the Scopes monkey trial, when the fundamentalists seem to have been publicly defeated in that context. If people haven't listened to earlier episodes, they might want to go back and have a listen to that episode and listen to that. That was really fascinating. But what Marsden says is, particularly when he writes his writings in the mid 2000s, he starts talking about the fact that fundamentalism is still having an impact on evangelicalism. And what we'll get to in later podcast episodes is talking about the whole phenomenon of Trump coming forward and so many Christian leaders coming out in support of Trump, which was quite a unexpected turn of events. And so there's a possible turn for fundamentalism in that moment. But right through the 80s and the 90s, which we want to talk about today, there's still there was the Moral Majority that was seeking to push back on some of the secularization that was happening in our society, but there's also this line of evangelicals that are continuing through the 1980s and the 1990s and onwards, evangelicals who are thinking, how do we continue to preach the gospel into our generation, and are organising around that rather than organising around a particular political issue. So I think what you find is evangelicals are continuing to come up with new ways to present the gospel to a changing culture.
So Tim, at that time around the later 1980s, what are your thoughts in terms of having a look at that particular time? Any things you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, it's just interesting looking at the Moral Majority and the way that they sort of harness the energy for the Christian vote, essentially. And, as we're all, Stu, you said just before we started recording, like we're all political in the sense that we vote. We are people that are in democracies, and so we there's a position there where we go out and those in Australia we've got another 4 or 6 weeks or so. We're going to vote in our federal election, and so there is a responsibility there. And what the Moral Majority is doing is sort of harnessing all of that, trying to pick all of these topics that are relevant to have some sort of spiritual or Christian moral impetus behind them, package them all up together under this big label of family values, and saying, this is where we're going to go. And so pulling along people as well. So people that may have voted all over the spectrum, actually trying to harness that and focus it in a particular way. And so thinking about these ideas like, yeah, as you said, abortion, divorce, feminism, gay and lesbian rights, all of these types of things that have some impact on understanding of how we understand families and family structures, the morality behind family structures, those kinds of things, and harnessing it all, pointing it all in a particular direction. And so, as you guys talked about, previous episode, the impact that had on the first Ronald Reagan election, and not as much as the second one. But what I find fascinating is the power and influence that the Christian vote seems to then have because they're able to focus in this particular way. And it also ties a particular understanding of what it means to have, Christian morals and values, really closely ties it to a political spectrum as well, which we see again sort of continue on from the 80s. We see that through into the more recent Trump era as well, is that to be a Christian is to have all of these particular values, and because the moral majority did so well in the messaging and the packaging of all of that with a particular end of the political spectrum, we see this convergence of Christian morality with a particular conservative political stance. And again, one of the things we're trying to tease apart here is that there was that politically active fundamentalist edge to that. And then the evangelicals are trying to have that through line, like we've talked about in a number of previous episodes, that hark back all the way to a number of generations earlier with Whitfield and Wesley and others who were just trying to preach the gospel, recognising that the gospel does have social implications, but not tying it to direct political action all the time and not making that a focus point of the way that they're expressing themselves. And so, the way that I was able to harness that, and the way that that has then captured the attention, the imagination, and the story of what it means to be a Christian, politically active person, particularly in America. Like, we're noticing a lot of these things last episode and this episode about what that means in America. It seems to be a different story in the UK and a different story in Australia. We'll talk really soon about what was happening in the 80s in Australia and how that was more influenced by that through line of evangelicalism rather than a sort of a partisan political fundamentalism, and we'll notice that. I think that's really interesting. But I think that it's how much that shapes the conversation, and therefore the confusion that we come up against now when people will say, "Oh, are you an evangelical?" and what they imagine that to be, the packaging that comes in their mind with that label. If you're an evangelical, therefore you are, and then they lay out all of these often conservative political definitions of that
from America,
rather than what we would want to say. No, an evangelical as these things. It is particular understandings of who Jesus is, what he is like, what he has done on the cross and his resurrection, who he calls us to be, our faith in him. And so, the confusion that comes here really becomes apparent in the 80s with the moral majority, and it still flavours exactly the tension that we're seeing now.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about that confusion, Stu? Like, is there I don't think there'd be an easy way, but is there a way to perhaps articulate ourselves? And I know that you think about this a lot. Is there a way to articulate ourselves to make it clear that the moral majority sounds like they've done a pretty good marketing job, in the sense of like putting those labels on, like you said, and packaging it in certain groups. But I think what we're trying to say is that we would like to think of ourselves as evangelicals. How do we tell people that, and how do we use that in a way to evangelize rather than putting political labels on it?
So I think what's really important in the last couple of episodes, and this one in particular, is for us to understand the history of evangelicalism, that there has been this fundamentalist tangent that some evangelicals go off into, and that's often quite particularly political and particularly public in its expression. Yeah. So a lot of the evangelical Protestant evangelical evangelism that's going on doesn't make the TV. So we talked about the fact that in America the moral majority was very, very public in the 80s, coming in against rock and roll, saying rock and roll's of the devil and syncopation is of the devil and you shouldn't have drums and guitars and all this sort of stuff. Particular bands like we've already mentioned some bands, but also other bands like Led Zeppelin and AC/DC. They were looking for backmasking in songs even as far back as the Beatles, and looking for lyrics that were going to take young people astray and lead them astray. But that wasn't just America. In England, there was also a really huge court case against a magazine called Oz Magazine, and Oz Magazine was pushing a lot of boundaries. It was 1960s, late 1960s, and there were actually some Australian editors in the Oz Magazine, and they were taken to court for the fact that their magazine was too explicit in its sexual content, and it was going to take young people astray. And you can look up on YouTube, just type in Oz Magazine trial in YouTube, and you can see all these Christians demonstrating outside the court with placards. So people have this public impression of Christians standing up against Oz Magazine, and Oz Magazine trial was again another example of where Christians were publicly defeated, I suppose. Through the public was actually more in favour with the sexual revolution that was taking people more in the side of Oz Magazine than that. So again, there's another moment that we wouldn't know about now, but it's part of the long-term social psyche of people are used to seeing Christians demonstrating against Oz Magazine. Another example is Christians demonstrating against the Life of Brian in England. When the Monty Python movie Life of Brian came out, there was big debates on TV where religious leaders were debating John Cleese on TV about whether it was something we should be going to see, and so there was a big pushback on that. Again, with the 1960s, John Lennon had that passing comment, the Beatles are bigger than Jesus, with a lot of young people. And again, Christians are on TV burning Beatles records and demonstrating. So there's this kind of, all these little instances going through history form people's opinion of what an evangelical is. And so people may not be particularly aware of one or two of those instances, but there's a cumulative effect that when we come forward and say, oh, I'm an evangelical, or I'm a Christian even, I'm a Protestant, people think of those kind of instances. In Australia, there was the Christian Democratic Party that was started as the Festival of Light under Fred Nile in the 1970s, and Fred is still actually, I think up until very recently, the head of that party, and he would publicly come out on television against a whole heap of causes, again saying a lot of moral causes that he would be arguing against. And Christians in churches were really torn. Like, some Christians were saying, how can you be a Christian and not vote for Fred Nile? And some Christians were saying, how can you be a Christian and vote for Fred Nile? Later, there's the Australian Christian lobby that has kind of, I suppose, taken that public position, so that during the same-sex marriage debate, the ACL was very prominent in the no corner and getting a lot of publicity for that. So for evangelical Christians who are keen to make their major effort to evangelise, we need to understand that there's a whole lot of baggage that comes as we talk to people about Jesus. They're going to be thinking of all these things. So the purpose of this podcast series is to partly go, it's good to be aware of all that, and then it's good to be thinking, well, if we can differentiate between fundamentalists and evangelicals, that will be helpful. Because if someone goes, oh, are you a Trump supporter, because all the Christians support Trump, don't they? Well, the Christian fundamentalists were supporting Trump, but evangelicals, not all evangelicals were supporting Trump. So just giving people that sense, so there's a difference between an evangelical and a fundamentalist. Yeah, there is, actually. Also, there's a difference between Australian evangelicals and American evangelicals, and that, I think, helps people then to listen. So what we're trying to do is help people to understand a little bit of the context that they're hearing the gospel in that regard, I think.
Anything you want to add, Tim?
Yeah, talk about responding in a sec, but I was just thinking when you're talking about Life of Brian and the picketing outside, and how that kind of plays into Marsden's definition that fundamentalists are those who are angry about something.
Yeah.
And so they're angry about the depiction of religion and Jesus in the Life of Brian, and so they go and picket. And the contrast in my mind was not a Christian one, but I heard that when the Book of Mormon came out in Broadway, which is quite, my understanding is quite a stinging mockery of the Latter-day Saints. I haven't seen it, but what I did hear about was that the Mormons actually did this advertising campaign. So they booked out all of the advertising spaces outside the theatre that it was in, and they just put up posters that said, "Seen the show, now read the book," and pick up a copy of the Book of Mormon, and then gave some website. And I just thought, there's a non-fundamentalist, like non-angry response. It was kind of like, yeah, we're being mocked, but we're not going to respond with pickets. We're going to respond with this, take it on the chin and then give our message. And I just thought that was just an interesting contrast between those two things. And a lot has changed culturally between when Life of Brian came out and then the Book of Mormon. But yeah, that was one of the things that came to me there. And it plays into that Marsden idea of what a fundamentalist is. In terms of your question to Stu about sort of how do we respond, I think one of the things that I'm really aware of is trying to unbundle these ideas. Like the moral majority tried to bundle these ideas together. And because they were a politically active movement, they were bundling Christian morality and Christian understandings, which were coming out of often right readings of Scripture, but tying it and bundling it so closely to a particular conservative political agenda. And often they'd bundle into their other conservative views that didn't really have Christian positions. But because they were conservative positions, they bundled all that in together as well. And so if I do have those conversations where people are like, oh, well, are you an evangelical? Are you a fundamentalist? Are you a Christian? Those kind of things. I think, if I'm sitting down for a long time, hopefully with someone having those conversations, I might ask them, well, can you define what you mean by that? And then as they start to unpack what they understand that term to mean, I can then be able to say, okay, well, that's interesting. You've heard that. I can see why you've picked those things up. Let me tell you how I understand that. And let me tell you about my faith and what that means and the positions that I might have on X, Y, and Z issue because of my faith. And that kind of, but I think it's the unbundling that is needed in this particular moment. And also resonated with what Stu was saying before about L'Abri being that place of exile for those who are feeling exiled from the church. And again, we're now, a generation, maybe 2 generations later from when L'Abri was first started, a generation from when Stu was there, when there was the Gen Xers that were feeling disenfranchised by the church. And now we've got a lot of millennials who are being really disenfranchised by the church. So we have the ex-evangelical movement and things like this where people are trying to distance themselves from what they understand Christianity to be. And a lot of the conversations I see in that space is also this kind of, they've been told that Christianity is this, and their church has bundled all of these ideas together, including a whole lot of political positions that they might not necessarily hold to, or they might interpret Scripture a little bit differently or see other ways of perceiving different ideas. But because they've been told, no, to be a Christian is also to be all of these other things, and you take the whole package or you leave the whole package, you've got people who are saying, well, therefore I mustn't be a Christian then. Or I think I'm still a Christian because I trust in the words of Jesus. I don't see how the words of Jesus line up with this package and particular positions within the package or particular people who are pushing that package. And so I think trying to unbundle these things is really helpful, which is why that through line of evangelicalism that says, here's what we're about. We're about whatever that Bebington quadrilateral was, the atonement, the Bible, the authority of the Bible, the individual conversion, and the appropriate social activism. Like having those 4 things and saying, okay, this is what evangelicalism is. And if we can unbundle that from a lot of things that may have been misapplied or may have just passed their time, like the rock and roll debate, we can start to have helpful conversations where we can help people see Jesus, because that's what we're about as evangelicals. We want people to see Jesus. And that will mean getting rid of some of the noise that's around it.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, so I think that's it. I think by even our young people in our churches are going to be helped by saying there is a differentiation between evangelicalism and fundamentalism, that not all evangelicals are angry about something and then get politically active. And so let's look at Jesus first, and who do you think he is? And then let's read the Bible together and try and work that other stuff out.
Yeah, that's really cool. Isn't Life of Brian one of your favourite movies?
I think Monty Python is one of my favourite
shows.
Comedian,
comedy troops.
It is. I think it's terrific. Actually, it's a very funny movie, and I think it's a good example of what we're talking about. Rather than see, I think with Life of Brian, I think they spent more time paying out Christians, and they did paying out Jesus. And some people use that as a hollow defense of the movie. But I think if you watch it, there's also a lot of political insights in the movie. And it's interesting, actually, because that movie, I think, is coming. One of the things that's interesting about Monty Python is some of our listeners and viewers might not be aware of them, but they're a comedy group that formed up pretty much in the late 1950s, early 1960s. And the way, what I think they actually helped the British in particular, and many Australians who were British Australians from heritage, kind of cope with the end of empire. And so they would be laughing at a lot of the things of the empire, and it kind of gave the British people an opportunity to move on. So they'd laugh at the English army, they'd laugh at the strictness of, the middle class, and the British stiff upper lip and all these kind of politeness, all that kind of stuff. But then also the whole idea of just, I think they were also coming into their fore at the end of Christendom too. So some of this moral majority, I think, is actually struggling to cope with the fact that Christendom is coming to an end, that there's no longer this connection between church and state so much, and that the church doesn't have this authority in the public square that it used to. So the Monty Python were kind of laughing at that that Christendom piece a little bit as well. So a lot of this moral majority in the 80s and 90s is Christians coming to the terms with actually, we're actually another minority in the community rather than the moral majority that is actually the majority of the community.
And I remember Jerry Falwell, the leader of the moral majority, saying, we're speaking up for the silent majority in a sense, for exactly what you're saying.
That's almost a Christendom view, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like that the majority of people are Christian and they're not talking up about all these changes, and we're going to represent them.
We've got to give it a platform, that kind of thing. Okay. So we also, we've already referenced a number of things in Australian history around that time. So I think that'd be cool to shine a light on that kind of thing. Two of the names that you've mentioned that we've decided to mention is Philip Jensen and John Chapman, who have been very influential at that time. Let's get into them, because I personally do not know that much about these guys.
Yeah, sure. So, Soul Revival's an Anglican church, Sydney Anglican church, so we thought it might be interesting just to look at some of the evangelicals from the Sydney Anglican history. There's lots of other examples that we could look at of Australian evangelicals, but looking at Philip Jensen's interesting because we were just talking about this recognition that something's changed in the 1960s and that there's this end of Christendom. Philip Jensen was a guy who grew up in a time where cultural Christianity was still quite common, and nominalism within that was very, very common. Philip grew up seeing that not everybody who was at church were Christians, and sometimes there were Christians on parish councils in churches and in Sunday school teachers and stuff that actually weren't Christians, but it was just culturally a good thing to be a Christian and be in a church. And you actually got some social status from being a Sunday school superintendent, and actually put that on your job resume when you would go for a job interview. So bank managers were superintendents of Sunday schools and things like that. So what Philip and his brother Peter would actually go on to be the Archbishop of Sydney in the 2000s. Philip would go on to become, in the 1980s, he would start working on a number of ministries that we can touch on today. But in the kind of late 60s, early 70s, Philip and his brother and others in that generation started to notice that a lot of people who weren't Christians stopped going to church. And rather than that being a bad thing, he actually thought it was a good thing, because there was the people who were left in churches, particularly those in authority, were actually Christians. So there was a big group of evangelicals that were actually not, I wouldn't say excited about the number of people that had stopped coming to church, but they're actually saying, well, actually the number of people who are going to church now are Christians, and so we can organise together as Christians to be a group within the society. So Philip got really involved with St. Matthias and campus Bible study at the University of New South Wales, and so interestingly he had a similar impulse to Francis Schaeffer in that he was seeking to start a ministry to university students and young people, but rather than being baby boomers, he started a ministry to late boomers and now Gen Xers coming through, and he had an incredibly phenomenally successful ministry at campus Bible study, and it was just a Bible study that young people would go to listen to. A lot of the young people would go out onto the library lawn at University of New South Wales and do what they call library lawning, which would be just go up and do cold-face evangelism. Come, do you believe in Jesus? Do you mind if we have a talk about Jesus? And they talk about it. They developed a thing called the MTS program, which was a ministry training scheme that meant a lot of the people who went through campus Bible study actually went on to go to Moore College and become ministers. So a huge number of people who went through our Bible college at Sydney came from campus Bible study. He also developed the 2 Ways to Live course, which was an evangelistic course that people would go through, which talked about the fact that Jesus is king and we've replaced his kingship with our own kingship, that we try to be our own authority and we worship the creation rather than the creator. And then the 2 Ways to Live is about thinking about actually having Jesus as king, that he came and he died for us and he rose from the dead. Really strong focus on the cross. And that course was in place for a number of years and became incredibly popular amongst a lot of Sydney Anglican churches. And so, yeah, that whole focus also led to a partnership between him and John Chapman, who may have been one of the greatest evangelists that Sydney produced, and his evangelism was so engaging and so terrific. He was so excited about the gospel, and he just had this very clear presentation of the gospel. So these men, John Chapman, Philip Jensen, Peter Jensen, people of that generation, were actually coming up against some of the traditionalism in the Anglican Church in Sydney. So there were those who were nervous about the impulse of these new generation of leaders that were coming through. They weren't wearing robes, they were wearing suits and ties, and they were sort of challenging some of that high church kind of expression for more of a lower church expression, and having a great deal of success within the Sydney context anyway. So so I think that was a really interesting phenomena that was taking place at the same time as Festival of Light or the moral majority were trying to be more active politically. There's this upswell of young people who are going to university to become professionals, but then being encouraged to actually not go into their desired profession, actually instead think about going into ministry and being a minister. And I was actually one of the young people that went through later in that era in the early 90s. My wife and I were at a mid-year conference at Campus Bible Study where we decided to take the offer of our local church minister who was offering us for me to be a youth minister at Guymer Anglican Church, made that decision under Philip's ministry, because he said rather than getting a job and then finding a church, getting a job, then finding a house and then finding a church, maybe you should find a church, then find a job so you can stay in a house near your church. And Lou and I took that seriously, and we actually did that at Guymer Anglican. So I don't know how many young people listen to that call, but yeah, that was a different kind of trajectory, and I think following through on that line of evangelicalism. Yeah,
with Chapo as he was known, in Wikipedia it has John Chapman and then in brackets evangelist, which I thought was pretty cool. But I only saw Chapo once, and he made you pay attention when you were listening to him. I was just wondering, Tim, did you have had any experience of seeing John Chapman speak in front of people? Because he definitely made sure he knew you were getting the message.
Oh, yes. I can remember once really clearly. I may have heard him 2 or 3 times at different events. But yeah, I do remember him coming as a guest speaker at our church once and just giving a sermon. And yeah, it was just super engaging. And he would have already been... he was an old man, when he was speaking at our church, but the energy and the vitality that came off him, particularly when he got up to speak about the gospel. And I don't remember having a one-on-one conversation with him, but remember him up the front. And yes, he just had this enthusiasm for Jesus and a deep love and desire that other people would know Jesus. And I think that really captures beautifully that idea of the evangelical is the one who the driving priority is that people know Jesus. And yes, there's all sorts of implications that come out of that. I think Philip and the way that he has shaped people's priorities, I think that they're all implications of the gospel. Why would you choose a particular place to live in and stay, and all those kinds of things, and how would you choose your career path, or how could you be confidently Christian in the workspace if you do go into professionalism. I think Philip and his brother Peter, who was also really significant, principal of our training college, Moore College, and Archbishop of our diocese, there's just been really, really clear, and that beautiful through line of here we are, we're opening up the Bible with people, talking about Jesus. That's our priority. That's what we are doing. I just think that's just really clear examples of that and that trajectory through which we've been painting over these last few episodes.
I just found an article about Chapo where he said Australians are hard to reach with the gospel because life here is so good, which he said at a national conference, and I think there's probably a fair bit of truth to that. Is there anything else in Australia, Stu, that was important around in that time that established that evangelical line? Yeah,
well, I think one of the things that John Chapman and Philip Jensen shared with many others in Australia, in Sydney as well, with evangelicals, was a propositional evangelism, where there was still this sense that we're going to present to you the gospel and show why it makes sense. Preaching is really key to these guys, and so preaching and the skill of preaching is taken really, really seriously. And they were building on the work of John Stott in Sydney, who was arguing for expository teaching, which is to go through the Bible and let the Bible speak for itself, rather than just having topical sermons here, there and everywhere. Actually take a book and read through it together and preach it well and present the gospel and present Jesus and the cross through preaching. So that was a really big focus, and many people had that focus during that time. During the 80s, though, too, there was still a bit of a hangover from the Jesus movement, particularly in charismatic circles, with groups like Hillsong that were emerging in the 80s, where Christian music was still a really powerful preaching tool that many people were using. So that was a bit of a contrast to Jensen and John Chapman, who were more the spoken word and continuing on that tradition, which was also, I suppose, a Billy Graham kind of preaching tradition of evangelism. But music still had a great deal of impact in Australia and around the world. The story goes that Hillsong in its early iterations, I think in the 1970s, was at some stage there was just about 30 adults meeting in a hall somewhere, and I think they call it Hills Christian Life Centre, I think at the time, something like that.
That's right.
And apparently one weekend a whole heap of hippies from Mullumbimby had decided that, the hippie movement had ended, and these Jesus people from Mullumbimby decided to come back to Sydney, and they visited this church. And apparently one side of I've talked to some people from Hillsong who were there that day, and one side of the church were all these adults, and one side of the church were all these hippies from Mullumbimby who just rocked up to the church to see what was going on. Apparently whoever the pastor was that day said to these young hippies, "Why don't you get up and play us some worship music?" And so they got up and they started playing their Jesus movement, sort of folky, sort of rock and roll, sort of Christian music, and that was the genesis of Hillsong music, which then ended up, the church changed its name to Hillsong. Arguably, they were prominent in really calling Christian music worship. They made a real strong. So this is happening at the same time as the Philip Jensen sort of stuff going in the Sydney Anglican churches. Hillsong Church grew exponentially, as many charismatic churches did, through music. But it wasn't just in the church music. There was also still a Christian music industry that had inherited the tradition of Larry Norman and Keith Green and all those guys in the 70s. There was a really huge Christian music industry that was still going on around the world. There were bands like Petra and Amy Grant and these kind of artists that were making huge amounts of following and lots of money, and that they were still preaching from a Jesus movement sort of rock and roll sort of style, putting Christian lyrics into contemporary music, and it was actually called contemporary Christian music. It wouldn't be until the early 90s that started to come out of fashion again. Tooth and Nail Records in the early 90s was probably one of the epochs of that contemporary Christian music, with bands like MXPX and this is kind of your genre here with all that.
Yeah, Tooth and Nail was a massive part of my adolescence. So yeah, I could rattle off a whole lot of bands, but that music, punk and hardcore metal kind of scene. But what was interesting is that they're gathering together people who are Christian or Christian adjacent and are making music, but they're also sort of challenging that heritage a little bit as well. So you didn't have to be really overtly Christian in your lyrics. And Tooth and Nail itself, they'd often put on other bands on the roster that weren't really Christian at all, but were happy to be within that scene, which was really interesting. So there's a whole kind of long story there. But it starts to fracture and break down a little bit, but it's also a little bit of that kind of, I suppose, a deconstruction of what it means to be a Christian band. And it had got to a point by the late 80s, early 90s in Christian music that there was a particular cookie cutter of what it meant to be a Christian band. You had to have this many, they talk about Jesus per minute. Like how many times can you name drop Jesus
JPMs.
in your song? Yeah, that's right. And it has a particular sound, and it's not particularly inventive or creative in that kind of scene. And so there was a lot of bands who were trying to push the creativity, kind of hold on to the Christianness and be seen in that. They would also challenge that a little bit as well. And so you've now got, we're now another 20 years after that, or 30 years after that. And you've got a lot of those bands like MXPX, who certainly the lead singer would no longer identify as a Christian. You've got a lot of deconstruction and deconverting happening from bands that were in that scene. Or you had people who were in that scene and went off to become pastors of churches. Like a number of the Supertones, they're all youth pastors and pastors of churches. A couple of the Five Line Frenzy people had started a church. You've kind of got this mix of things happening, but part of it is a challenge to that Amy Grant era, a deconstruction of that, trying to work out what does it mean to be authentically Christian in that space. And what's really interesting is we track that through to today. What I've noticed is that there's a lot less who are in that blurry middle. It seems to have now completely fractured again, and Christian music largely now is praise and worship.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And so you've got the big Christian bands, whereas in the 90s you had these big Christian bands that were punk and rock and alternative, whereas now it's really just the praise and worship bands. It's the Wren Collectives and the Hillsong United, for King and Country and all that. They're the ones who are kind of the big stars in the Christian music industry at the moment.
Mm-hmm. That's just another thing on that. I think what's really interesting is rock and roll did become a huge evangelistic device in the 70s, and then it went through into the 80s. But then by the 90s, the whole idea of a Christian band was becoming an anathema to a lot of Gen Xers. And so then there was this idea that we're not a Christian band, we are Christians in a band. And so there was this really strong differentiation in the 90s from the 80s. But what got lost was that evangelistic edge. Like when I was young and I'd go to a concert, there was this heartfelt call to the young people in the audience to think about making a commitment to Christ. But not only that, there was this huge underground scene in Sydney with all these bands in Sydney, like In the Silence with John Dixon. There was Priority Paid was another big band. I actually met my wife Louise at a Priority Paid concert at Glebe Town Hall. We were both from the Shire, but we both travelled over there. So we'd all go all over Sydney listening to all these bands every week, and that was it was actually a really sad thing that we've lost that, because one of my favourite bands, Surprise, was really good at actually articulating a lot of our angst as young Christians and talking about the topics we were interested in talking about, and we had a voice. But I think a lot of young Christians have lost that voice in the context of seeing that as a bit daggy. But that's a change in evangelism. So Christian music used to be an evangelistic device. It isn't anymore. Another thing you were saying is what else was happening within evangelism in the 80s and 90s was, I think there was also this big debate between mainline Protestants and some of the charismatic areas. I know when John Wimber came to Sydney, there was a delegation of evangelical leaders from Sydney Anglican churches that went to the airport to ask him to get back on the plane and go home. Wow. Because he was saying that unless you have preaching with power, with manifestations of the Holy Spirit, with healings and speaking in tongues, then it's not really preaching. It's not being preached with power. So some of those debates were raging in the 80s and 90s. And again, there's still some baggage that we have from some of those debates, that sometimes evangelicals can be seen as too strict and, looking for an argument all the time, because whenever there's a discussion about doctrine, sometimes that can deteriorate into an unhelpful conversation, or even if it doesn't, it can still be seen as conflictual. And progressively more as we get into the 90s and 2000s, people are becoming more interested in changing the nature of debate. And we have a rise of safe spaces and microaggressions and all these kind of things. So sometimes evangelicals are seen as too hard edge. So even if we're not associated with fundamentalists, sometimes we're seen as too dogmatic or too opinionated. And sometimes it goes back to some of those earlier debates in the 80s and 90s, which is good to be aware of,
Yeah, I think that we've touched on a lot of topics there. Just before, we've got a question, so I'd like to go to that. But if anything else you wanted to add there, Tim, before we do that?
No, I think that's been really good. Yeah, thanks.
No, thank you. I've learned a lot, so thank you very much. We've got a question, though, from Andrew, who emailed me a couple of weeks ago. So sorry we're only getting to it just now, but that was because I was in COVID isolation. He's very complimentary to begin with, which is very nice of him. Thanks for listening, Andrew. He says, thanks to you, Stu and Tim, for the recent episode, Are All Evangelicals Fundamentalists? And for the whole podcast as a whole. I've been racing through them, so I still haven't caught up to the present time, but he's getting through them because he skipped onto that episode because it was really interesting for him. I thought it would be worth breaking down his question into two parts. So the first section, he says, here's what I'm not willing to accept yet. The definition of fundamentalist being a politically driven Christian. I'd get that this is the popular usage, but I don't think evangelist Christians should be so willing to give up the label fundamentalist to others when it also describes anyone who believes the gospel is fundamental to humanity surviving judgment and getting to heaven rather than hell. I know lots of non-believers would ask me if I was a Christian fundamentalist, and if I said yes, I would conclude I want to be real hardcore on a lot of those issues that we've talked about previously. But if I say no, they will conclude I don't believe Jesus rose from the dead and is the only way to heaven, because these are fundamentals to the faith too. So Stu, do you want to take that first, and then we can go on to his next question as well, which is it's talking about how we're trying to tease apart those two kind of labels.
I think that's really good, Andrew, and thank you for your patience with us. We're just thinking out loud too. We're having to think about some of these things and looking at culture and listening to what people are saying and having to think about it, looking at history. So the conversation is really valuable to us. I suppose what we're trying to say, I think, is that evangelicals and fundamentalists actually have the same starting point. They believe in the fundamentals of the gospel. So what we're trying to say, though, is when people... So if someone was to say, I'm a fundamentalist because I believe Jesus rose from the dead, I would be happy to say, I believe Jesus rose from the dead. Mm-hmm. And if they want to call me a fundamentalist, then that's up to them. They can call me a fundamentalist. But what I am thinking is that if someone says, because you believe Jesus rose from the dead, are you aligned with people who thought rock and roll was really evil and we should get rid of it? I would probably say, look, there's some parts of rock and roll that I don't think are terrifically edifying, but I don't think we throw out the whole genre as a result. So I believe in the fundamentals of Scripture, but I'm not angry about rock and roll. So that's the point where I try and make a differentiation between evangelicalism and fundamentalism. But if someone calls me a fundamentalist because I go to church, I'm unapologetic about that. Yeah,
you will wear that label with pride because you go to church.
I'm happy to wear that label if that's what they want to say. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Anything you want to add there, Tim?
No, only that, again, like I talked about earlier, it's that unbundling. And I think this is where the difficulty may lie. And I've had this conversation with a few different people. Is, do we want to hold on to the label fundamentalist because we believe the fundamentals of the faith? And what do we do with that? So I'd want to unbundle those things, because if I'm talking to someone who, well, even if I'm talking to a Christian, but if I'm talking to someone who is outside the church and is looking in, and they go, so are you one of those fundamentalists? I'd want to have the conversation where I tease that out, and And Andrew's right. If I just say yes, they're going to assume a whole lot because they come with a particular package in mind when they ask that question. And it might even be someone within the church who themselves, maybe they hold on to more of that package than I would. But if they ask if I'm a fundamentalist, and if I said, I believe the fundamentals of the faith, they go, oh, good. So you hold on to all of this package that I also hold on to. And I might want to say, well, hold on, let's pull that apart and let's look at each of those one by one. But again, do I believe in the fundamentals of the faith? Absolutely. The other thing just to note for Andrew and others listening in is language does change over time. And that's just, languages are organic and ideas are organic. And there are times when it is appropriate to fight for a label, and then other times where it's okay to let labels go because language and culture has changed. And I think what we're doing is it's a couple of things, but one is we want to try and draw that through line. We're trying to hold on to the label of evangelical. I think that's one of the things. Where I've heard some debates, particularly some commentators in America who, like us, would believe in the fundamentals of the faith. They would be firmly in the evangelical camp, but are questioning, do we hold on to this label or do we discard the label evangelical altogether and find something else, a Christ-following Christian or whatever they're trying to explore, and there's nothing really certain to hold on to. We're trying to hold on to that because we think there's an important lineage to hold on to. But because of the trajectory that we've been noting over a number of episodes of how fundamentalists have this particular view, that historians like Marsden, political scientists use labels like fundamentalists for their polling and other things, I think it is good and right for us to tease those apart so that we can be really clear on the things that we do believe. And that's what we want to hold on to.
And moving on to the second part of Andrew's question, we might have already answered, but I wanted to honour his question by saying the same thing. He wants to find out what is a better descriptive term that we can think of. He thinks that we need to be absolutists or essentialists or whatever the right term is, and feels like we're wasting everyone's time if we're not. But he doesn't know how to express this while distinguishing themselves from the very politically active, what we would term fundamentalists. He says that whenever someone talks about Francis Schaeffer or Mother Teresa forsaking civilized comforts to devote their whole lives to the gospel, they are talking about people who are focused on the fundamental truths, no matter that matter more than their own quality of life. So we, in some cases, we are definitely fundamentalists in practice, but how do we express this? Express this is his question. Anything else you want to add into that?
Well, Andrew might even want to hold on to the title fundamentalist and make that the category that he considers to be most helpful to explain what a Bible-believing Christian is, someone who takes the Bible as the Word of God and seeks to put it into practice in their life. I still really like the word evangelical because I like the fact that it comes from the Greek word euangelion, which means good news. And I think a good news Christian is someone who is making the most important thing, which is what I think Jesus does in Mark chapter 1, verse 15, when he says that he had come to bring the kingdom of heaven, and he calls on us to believe and repent repent of our sins and believe in that message. And I think that's really cool. I reckon it's really clear. I really love it. And it's really ancient, but it's also really important now. And I think trying to have this conversation is actually really helpful for particularly young people who don't have a historical context of all this stuff that we're talking about and just don't feel like they're resonating with their church. They can have a conversation with their youth pastor about this a bit more. Do you think we're at our church we're evangelicals who are angry about something, or are we just on about the gospel? It just starts a good conversation. It can be helpful for people who aren't Christians as well, who think they know who we are and think we know what we stand for, but we might surprise them and delight them that actually we're into something that's even more abiding than just having a particular political view of the most current social issue that seems to be talked about. So I think we're all going to make different decisions on that. I'm really comfy with the word evangelical, and for me that means believing in the fundamentals of the Christian faith. So I don't know what you think, Tim, but that's how I feel.
When it comes to evangelism, this is what this whole series is about, right? Like we're talking about whatever happened to evangelism. The point of evangelism is to make the gospel comprehensible and understandable to the person you're trying to reach. And there comes a point where particular labels or words may actually be hindering your ability to communicate that message rather than helping your ability to communicate that message. Like really simply, I just right then typed in fundamentalist into Google Images. All of the things that come up, you can imagine, like one of them is, are you angry? You might be a fundamentalist. Another one is someone who's beaten someone to death with a Bible and there's blood all over the Bible.
Oh, dear.
And like, so if this is what Google is going to throw up at my inquiring friend when they look at fundamentalism, then this is the picture they come with. And so if I, try and hold on really tightly to that label, I've got a lot more work to do, which is unnecessary work when it needs to actually, I just want to communicate who Jesus is, what he has done for you on the cross, and how you have been given an invite into that kingdom. And we can talk about all the other implications of that as we go, and a lifelong discipleship. That's what Jesus calls us to in Matthew 28. Go make disciples of all nations, and that includes the initial, communicating the gospel to someone and the lifelong walking with someone as you grow them in faith and they grow us in faith. That's all fine, but the clarity of having a clear gospel presentation, if we can just remove the barriers from people that they have so that the message of Jesus is clear, that's what we want to do. As evangelicals, that's the key thing, is that, it's about the atonement. It's about a firm understanding of what the God's word is, and it's about the personal response that we need to make to that. And I want to make that as winsome and clear to people as possible. And when the fundamentalists we've been arguing in history have been distracted by this political activism, is that, again, even if we agree with the moral parts of that they were agreeing with, there are certain things about family values that I'd say, yes, that they are biblical values. But we're talking about Jesus and we're talking about our relationship with Jesus, and that's where we want to focus. We want to get people clear there. And so I don't think I would use the word fundamentalist, for myself. I just don't think that in this particular culture with the particular people I want to reach and the particular conversations I want to have, I don't think it's a helpful turn. That doesn't mean, as Andrew's question said, that I'm chucking out the historicity of Jesus or anything. Like, absolutely, Apostles' Creed, believe, that Nicene Creed. I'm a Nicene Creed Christian. Those things are absolutely true, and I hold on to them firmly for the sake of others seeing who Jesus is and seeing him really beautifully, as that excitement we talk about John Chapman have, the glow on his face about who he knows Jesus to be and how he wants other people to be brought into that as well. That's where I want my passion and my attention to be. And I just think some of these other packaged items and being able to unbundle from those is more a clarity to who Jesus is, and that's the most important thing.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic way to end. So thank you very much, Tim. And I think, but also just before we do end, that's all we're trying to do on the podcast, is to talk about it and raise the discussion about it, to understand it so that we can evangelize better, because that is the key. It's people's salvation is key, and we're going to partner with God as he wins people over for his kingdom. And I think that's what we're trying to do more than anything else, than try and place labels on ourselves or other people or anything like that. We don't really want to create division in any sense. It's more about how are we going to do this together with God, and I think that's what we're trying to do. So thank you very much for your time on the podcast today. Thank you to everyone for listening. And I have learned a lot, as always, so I appreciate it. Guys, if you're listening or watching like Andrew, you can email me a question in on joel@shockabsorber.com.au. You can subscribe to our email newsletter at shockabsorber.com.au. You can subscribe to the podcast or subscribe to our YouTube channel, Soul Revival Church. There's a Discord link in the show notes where we can talk about this as well. As always, thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for being on the podcast, guys. Really appreciate it. And as always, finish with a one way.
One way.